The morning mist revealed 7 empty slave quarters and not a single overseer left alive to tell the tale. By sunrise on August 12, 1852, the most audacious liberation operation in American history had freed over 300 enslaved souls from plantations across 3 Nevada counties, leaving behind only mysterious symbols carved into fence posts and the lingering scent of freedom on the desert wind. This is the story of how Alliah Vorric, a seamstress with secrets, orchestrated the single most devastating blow against the western expansion of slavery. The Nevada Territory's cotton empire crumbled in one coordinated night of precision strikes that left plantation owners bankrupt, their human property vanished into the mountains, and their entire economic system in ruins. No shots were fired. No buildings burned. Yet by dawn, generations of bondage had been shattered by a network so sophisticated that authorities never discovered how it operated. What they found instead would haunt the American West for decades to come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sheriff Calvin Drake stood in the abandoned quarters of the Westwind Plantation, staring at walls that should have housed 60 enslaved souls but contained only empty beds and a single carved symbol on the doorframe. The mark looked like interlocking circles with lines radiating outward, unlike anything in his 20 years of law enforcement. Outside, the August morning heat already shimmered off the Nevada desert, but inside these quarters an unnatural chill seemed to linger. "They're all gone," reported Deputy Owen Travis, his voice tight with disbelief. "Every last one, men, women, elderly folks who could barely walk yesterday, vanished like smoke in the wind." The plantation owner, Kieran Dravath, paced frantically among the empty buildings, his face flushed red despite the early hour. $300,000 in property, Sheriff, gone. You have to understand what this means for the territory. Drake nodded grimly. He understood perfectly. The Nevada Territory's cotton empire depended on enslaved labor imported from eastern states. If word spread that entire plantation populations could disappear overnight without trace or violence, it would destabilize the entire regional economy. Worse, it would inspire similar disappearances across the American West. "Any signs of struggle?" Drake asked, though he already knew the answer. The quarters were unnaturally orderly. Personal belongings remained neatly arranged. Cooking pots sat clean and ready for meals that would never be prepared. Even the livestock appeared calm and well-tended. "That's what disturbs me most," Travis admitted. "Looks like they just finished their evening routines and walked away. But how does 60 people move through desert country without leaving tracks? And where would they go?" The nearest free territory lay 400 miles north, through some of the harshest landscape in America. Mountain ranges, scorching valleys, and hostile weather created natural barriers that had kept Nevada's enslaved population effectively trapped. Even successful runaways typically survived only days before dying of exposure or being recaptured. Drake examined the carved symbol more closely. The wood around it appeared freshly cut, as if someone had taken time to create this mark while the liberation was occurring. It suggested coordination and planning rather than desperate escape. Someone had wanted this symbol found. "Sir," Travis called from across the yard, "you need to see this." Near the plantation house, they discovered a second symbol carved into a fence post. This one was larger and more elaborate, with additional markings that looked almost like a map. Lines connected various points, with small circles marking specific locations. As they studied the carving, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon, riders approaching fast from the direction of the neighboring plantations. Drake's stomach tightened as he recognized the frantic pace of men bearing bad news. The first rider, a plantation overseer named Jonas Thalvin, barely reined in his horse before shouting, "Sheriff, they hit us too, every last soul gone from Copper Creek. Same as here, not a sign of violence, just empty quarters, and that damned symbol." The second rider confirmed the pattern. Broken Arrow Plantation, 40 miles south, reported identical circumstances. Then came reports from 4 more properties across the region. 7 plantations struck simultaneously. Their entire enslaved populations vanished without violence, pursuit, or recoverable trail. Drake felt the weight of territorial politics settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Nevada's application for statehood depended partly on demonstrating stable economic conditions and effective law enforcement. A coordinated liberation of this magnitude suggested organized resistance that could undermine everything the territory's leaders had worked to build. "How many total?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Over 300 souls," Thalvin replied. "Biggest loss of property in Western history. If they're not recovered quickly, it'll bankrupt half the cotton operations in the territory." The mathematical reality struck Drake like a physical blow. 300 people represented nearly $2 million in property value, more than most Eastern banks held in reserve. The financial impact would ripple through every business and political relationship in the region. But the psychological impact might prove even more devastating. For decades, slavery's expansion westward had been justified by claims that enslaved populations could be effectively controlled in frontier conditions. If someone had demonstrated otherwise, it would encourage resistance movements across the entire American West. "Any witnesses?" Drake asked. "Someone must have seen something." "That's the strangest part," admitted another overseer. "Night guards report nothing unusual, dogs never barked. No sounds of movement, no disturbance of any kind. Like 300 people just evaporated into thin air." Drake studied the symbol again, noting details he had missed initially. The carving showed tool marks consistent with multiple hands working simultaneously. The design's complexities suggested advanced planning and coordination between different groups. Someone had spent considerable time preparing this operation. As the morning progressed, more disturbing details emerged. The disappeared populations included elderly people who couldn't walk long distances, young mothers with infants, and individuals with chronic illnesses. These were not the typical candidates for risky escape attempts. Yet somehow, they had all vanished together without leaving recoverable trails. The coordinated timing bothered Drake most. 7 plantations struck simultaneously across a region spanning over 200 square miles, required communication systems and logistical planning beyond anything previously seen in slave resistance. Someone had created an organization capable of military-level coordination while operating invisibly within Nevada's enslaved communities. "Sheriff," Travis said quietly, "if they pulled this off once, what's to stop them from doing it again?" The question hung in the desert air like a threat. Every plantation owner in the territory would be demanding protection they couldn't afford and guarantees Drake couldn't provide. The Nevada cotton empire had been built on assumptions about control and containment that someone had just proven false. Drake looked out across the empty quarters one more time, trying to imagine the logistics of moving 300 people through hostile territory without detection. It would require advanced scouts, supply caches, safe houses, transportation, and most importantly, someone with the intelligence and determination to coordinate such an ambitious operation. The carved symbols suggested this wasn't random or desperate action. Someone had planned this liberation with the precision of a military campaign and the patience of a long-term strategist. Someone who understood both the plantation system's vulnerabilities and the desert's possibilities for concealment. As Drake prepared to ride to the next affected plantation, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was investigating not just a crime, but the opening move in a larger campaign that would reshape the American West. The empty quarters around him felt less like crime scenes than battlefields where an invisible war had been won without firing a shot. The Nevada Territory in 1852 represented the western frontier of American slavery, a vast expanse of desert and mountain country where ambitious planters sought to recreate the cotton wealth of the Deep South. Unlike the established plantation regions of Georgia or Mississippi, Nevada's agricultural empire was barely a decade old, built on the promise that enslaved labor could transform harsh landscape into profitable cotton fields. The territorial capital of Carson Valley had grown from a trading post to a bustling center of commerce in less than 15 years. Main Street featured the imposing facades of cotton warehouses, banking houses, and the offices of land speculators who had carved enormous plantations from what had recently been wilderness. The Nevada Cotton Exchange operated from a 3-story brick building that dominated the town square, its daily auctions determining prices for crops grown by enslaved hands across the region. 7 major plantations controlled most of the territory's agricultural production. West Wind Plantation, owned by Kieran Drevith, sprawled across 12,000 acres of irrigated desert that produced some of the finest cotton west of the Mississippi River. Copper Creek, managed by the Thalvin family, specialized in both cotton and wheat, using sophisticated irrigation systems that made desert farming profitable. Broken Arrow Plantation, under the control of Sandro Dramier, focused on experimental crops and livestock breeding. Each plantation operated as a self-contained community with its own workshops, medical facilities, and administrative buildings. The enslaved populations lived in purpose-built quarters, designed to house large numbers of people efficiently while maintaining the social control necessary for plantation discipline. These were not the ramshackle slave quarters of older regions, but carefully planned communities intended to maximize productivity while minimizing resistance. The territory's isolation provided natural security against escape attempts. The nearest free territory lay hundreds of miles north through mountain passes that remained blocked by snow for much of the year. To the west, the Sierra Nevada mountains created a nearly impassable barrier. East and south stretched vast expanses of desert where water sources were scarce and hostile weather could kill the unprepared within days. This geographical reality had convinced plantation owners that Nevada offered unique advantages for slavery's expansion. Unlike eastern regions where underground railroad networks provided assistance to runaways, the western territories seemed to offer no such organized resistance. The harsh environment itself served as an effective prison, eliminating the need for extensive patrols or expensive security measures. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Nevada's enslaved population had grown rapidly through direct importation from eastern slave markets. Plantation owners specifically purchased young, healthy individuals capable of adapting to desert conditions and intensive agricultural labor. By 1852, nearly 2,000 enslaved people worked in the territory, representing millions of dollars in capital investment and the foundation of Nevada's economic development. The territorial government actively supported slavery's expansion through favorable legislation and tax policies. Governor Alliah Vorric, himself a plantation investor, had lobbied successfully for federal policies that encouraged agricultural development in western territories. The Nevada Territorial Assembly had passed strict slave codes modeled on those of South Carolina, creating legal frameworks designed to prevent resistance and ensure absolute control over enslaved populations. Banking and credit systems had evolved to support the plantation economy's unique needs. The Nevada Territorial Bank, headquartered in Carson Valley, specialized in loans secured by enslaved people as collateral. Insurance companies had developed policies specifically for Western plantation owners, covering losses from escape attempts, illness, and environmental hazards unique to desert agriculture. The social structure of territorial society reflected the economic importance of plantation agriculture. Plantation owners formed the unofficial aristocracy, their wealth and political influence shaping everything from territorial legislation to church construction. Below them, a middle class of overseers, mechanics, and merchants served the plantation economy's needs. At the bottom, free workers competed for employment in a system where enslaved labor provided most of the territory's productive capacity. Cultural institutions had developed to support and justify this economic arrangement. The Nevada Territory Improvement Society published pamphlets describing the civilizing influence of plantation agriculture on both landscape and people. Churches preached sermons about the moral benefits of bringing enslaved populations to the frontier, where they could be properly supervised and instructed. Newspapers celebrated the territory's agricultural achievements while rarely mentioning the human cost of those accomplishments. Communication networks connected Nevada's plantations to markets and information sources across the continent. Weekly stagecoach service carried mail and newspapers from eastern cities, keeping plantation owners informed about cotton prices, political developments, and agricultural innovations. Telegraph lines reached the largest plantations, enabling rapid coordination of business activities across the territory. The military presence remained minimal, reflecting confidence in the natural barriers that contained enslaved populations. Fort Valmont, a small garrison 30 miles from Carson Valley, housed fewer than 50 soldiers, whose primary duties involved protecting against occasional conflicts with local Native American tribes. Territorial leaders had argued successfully that extensive military forces were unnecessary given the geographic advantages Nevada offered for maintaining plantation security. This confidence in natural containment had shaped every aspect of how Nevada's plantation system operated. Overseers carried out their duties with less vigilance than their counterparts in regions where escape routes existed. Plantation owners invested in long-term improvements, confident that their workforce would remain stable for decades. The entire territorial economy had developed on assumptions about control and security that someone had just proven catastrophically wrong. The irrigation systems that made Nevada agriculture possible also created vulnerabilities that few had considered. Miles of canals and water channels provided potential travel routes that avoided main roads and populated areas. The engineering knowledge required to maintain these systems meant that some enslaved people possessed detailed understanding of regional geography and infrastructure. Work patterns on Nevada plantations required coordination between different properties during planting and harvest seasons. Enslaved workers frequently moved between plantations for temporary assignments, creating communication networks that plantation owners had never fully understood or controlled. What seemed like efficient labor management had inadvertently created opportunities for information sharing and relationship building across the entire regional enslaved community. The territorial government's focus on encouraging rapid economic development had led to policies that prioritized growth over security. Immigration incentives attracted plantation owners who brought enslaved populations without extensive background investigations. The emphasis on individual property rights meant that plantation owners operated with minimal governmental oversight of their labor management practices. Alliah Vance had learned to make herself invisible in plain sight, a skill that kept her alive for 26 years in a system designed to erase her humanity. To the plantation owners and overseers who employed her services, she was simply the seamstress who traveled between properties, mending clothing and creating garments with an expertise that made her indispensable. To the enslaved communities she served, she was something far more valuable, a source of information, hope, and quiet resistance that connected isolated populations across the Nevada territory. Born on a tobacco plantation in Virginia, Alliah had been sold west as a teenager when her original owner faced financial difficulties. The journey to Nevada had taken 3 months, during which she had observed every detail of the landscape, noting water sources, safe camping spots, and the rhythms of frontier travel. While other enslaved people focused on surviving the immediate hardships of relocation, Alliah had been mapping escape routes in her mind. Her needlework skills had earned her unusual privileges within the plantation system. Enslaved seamstresses were valuable enough to justify investment in training and equipment, but not threatening enough to warrant close supervision. Alliah could travel between plantations under the pretext of delivering finished garments or consulting on complex projects, movements that would have been impossible for field workers or house servants. This mobility had given her unique insights into the Nevada Territory's enslaved communities. She knew which plantations housed the most desperate people, which overseers could be avoided or manipulated, and which enslaved individuals possessed skills that could prove useful in resistance activities. More importantly, she had identified others who shared her refusal to accept permanent bondage. Alliah's workshop, located in a converted storage building at Westwind Plantation, served as an unofficial intelligence center for resistance planning. The constant flow of clothing repairs brought her into contact with enslaved people from across the region, each carrying news about conditions on their respective properties. She learned about harvest schedules, overseer travel patterns, security weaknesses, and the personal histories of potential allies or threats. Her reputation for discretion had made her a trusted confidant for people struggling with the psychological pressures of enslavement. Alliah understood that successful resistance required more than anger or desperation. It demanded careful planning, emotional discipline, and the ability to think strategically about long-term consequences. She had spent years identifying individuals who possessed these qualities. The seamstress work also provided cover for her most dangerous activities. Hidden within bolts of fabric and sewing supplies, Alliah smuggled maps, written communications, and small tools between plantations. Her needles and thread could be used to mark secret messages in clothing seams, creating communication systems that overseers never suspected. The very tools of her trade became instruments of rebellion. Alliah's personal relationships reflected the careful balance she maintained between appearing compliant and building resistance networks. She had married Calvin Drake, a freed blacksmith whose shop in Carson Valley provided another crucial link in her information chain. Their marriage offered her additional travel opportunities and access to resources beyond the plantation system, while Calvin's status as a property owner gave him legal protections that could benefit resistance activities. The couple's home, a small house behind Calvin's blacksmith shop, had become a secret meeting place for the territory's most committed resistance organizers. Sunday visits, ostensibly for religious services or social gatherings, actually served as planning sessions for increasingly ambitious operations. Alliah used these meetings to share intelligence, coordinate activities, and recruit new participants for her growing network. Her leadership style emphasized patience and preparation over dramatic gestures. While others spoke of violent uprising or desperate escape attempts, Alliah advocated for systematic organization that could achieve sustainable results. She understood that premature action would bring retaliation that could destroy any chance for successful resistance, while careful preparation might enable liberation on a scale that could reshape the entire territory. The network she had built over 8 years included people with diverse skills and access to different resources. May Linton, an enslaved cook at Copper Creek Plantation, provided information about overseer routines and could influence food supplies during critical operations. Aaron Valmont, a stable hand at Broken Arrow, understood transportation logistics and maintained relationships with free workers who might assist resistance activities. Rowena Drelith, an elderly woman respected throughout the territory's enslaved communities, served as a cultural and spiritual leader whose endorsement gave Alliah's plans legitimacy among people who might otherwise resist organized resistance. Her presence in the network provided moral authority that transcended plantation boundaries and individual loyalties. The most challenging aspect of Alliah's position involved managing the psychological pressures of living simultaneously as a compliant seamstress and a resistance leader. She had to maintain the facade of acceptance while nurturing the anger and determination necessary for sustained opposition. The constant performance required to survive in both roles had shaped her into someone capable of extraordinary self-control and strategic thinking. Her workshop contained evidence of this double life in details only she could recognize. Patterns for clothing included coded information about travel routes and safe houses. Thread colors corresponded to specific plantations and their security conditions. Even her most innocent sewing projects carried hidden messages that connected resistance activities across hundreds of miles. Alliah's understanding of the plantation system's vulnerabilities came from years of careful observation and analysis. She had identified the seasonal patterns that created opportunities for coordinated action, the communication gaps that could be exploited for moving people undetected, and the psychological weaknesses of overseers and owners who had grown complacent about security in their isolated territory. The plan she had developed required precise timing, extensive coordination, and the participation of dozens of people who would have to trust her with their lives. Unlike previous resistance efforts that focused on individual escape or localized rebellion, Alliah envisioned something unprecedented, a coordinated liberation that would free entire plantation populations simultaneously while establishing safe passage to free territory. Her calculations suggested that such an operation was possible, but only if executed with military precision and supported by resources beyond what any individual plantation could provide. The network she had built represented years of preparation for a single night, when everything would depend on whether her careful planning could overcome the geographical and political forces that had made Nevada Territory seem like an impregnable fortress for slavery's expansion. The autumn of 1851 brought a series of developments that tested every assumption about slavery's stability in the Nevada Territory. Cotton prices had plummeted due to increased competition from Texas plantations, forcing territorial owners to intensify their search for cost reductions that inevitably came at the expense of enslaved people's welfare. The economic pressures created a cascade of increasingly harsh conditions that pushed the territory's enslaved population toward desperation. Kieran Dravith at Westwind Plantation implemented new productivity quotas that required field workers to process 20% more cotton daily while reducing food rations to compensate for declining profit margins. The mathematical impossibility of meeting these demands with reduced nutrition created a cycle of punishment and deteriorating health that affected every family in the quarters. Alliah watched people she had known for years waste away while working longer hours than their bodies could sustain. The brutal mathematics of plantation economics became visible in the account books that occasionally passed through Alliah's workshop for repair or rebinding. Property inventories listed enslaved people alongside livestock and equipment, with depreciation schedules that calculated how quickly human beings lost monetary value through aging, injury, or illness. She discovered that plantation owners had begun categorizing older or disabled individuals as non-productive assets, whose elimination would improve overall profitability. Copper Creek Plantation under the Thalvin family introduced a new disciplinary system that imposed collective punishment for individual infractions. When one person arrived late for work or failed to meet quotas, entire families lost food privileges or faced extended working hours. The policy created tensions within enslaved communities as people were forced to monitor and report on each other to avoid group punishment. May Linton reported from the plantation kitchen that she had overheard conversations about selling off surplus population to sugar plantations in Louisiana, where mortality rates were notoriously high, but labor demands created markets for people considered too old or weak for cotton production. The discussions treated human beings as excess inventory to be liquidated for whatever prices could be obtained. Broken Arrow Plantations' experimental programs had taken increasingly sinister directions under Sandro Dremer's management. The operation began testing new cotton varieties that required exposure to chemical treatments known to cause respiratory problems and skin conditions. Enslaved workers assigned to these experimental fields developed chronic coughs and rashes, while being denied medical treatment that might interfere with research data collection. The territorial government's response to economic pressures involved relaxing legal protections that had provided minimal safeguards for enslaved people's welfare. New legislation eliminated requirements for adequate food and shelter, giving plantation owners complete discretion over living conditions. The legal changes reflected political pressure from plantation interests who argued that excessive regulation hindered Nevada's economic competitiveness. Communication between plantations increased as owners coordinated their response to market conditions. Joint planning sessions produced standardized policies for reducing costs through decreased food allowances, extended working hours, and elimination of medical care for anyone not considered essential to productivity. The coordination that might have improved efficiency instead created systematic cruelty on an unprecedented scale. Alliah's intelligence network revealed disturbing patterns in how plantation owners discussed their human property during business meetings. Conversations recorded by enslaved house servants indicated that owners were calculating break-even points for maintaining versus replacing their workforce. Some had concluded that working people to death and purchasing replacements would prove more profitable than providing adequate food and medical care. The psychological pressure on enslaved communities intensified as people realized that their survival depended entirely on maintaining productivity levels that were becoming physically impossible. Families began competing against each other for access to slightly better food or working conditions, creating divisions that plantation owners encouraged as management tools. Aaron Valmont from the stables reported increased shipments of shackles, chains, and other restraint equipment to plantations across the territory. The hardware suggested that owners anticipated increased resistance and were preparing more severe control measures. Some plantations had begun constructing isolation cells designed for prolonged confinement of anyone suspected of plotting resistance. Medical care became a luxury available only to enslaved people whose skills made them irreplaceable. Plantation doctors received instructions to prioritize treatment based on economic value rather than medical need, leaving elderly people, injured workers, and anyone with chronic conditions to suffer without intervention. The policy effectively turned plantations into death camps where people died from treatable conditions because treatment costs exceeded their market value. Winter clothing allocations were reduced to save money, forcing enslaved people to work in freezing temperatures with inadequate protection. Frostbite and hypothermia became common problems that received no medical attention. The combination of cold exposure, inadequate nutrition, and increased work demands created health crises that affected entire communities. Rowena Drellith, whose age and wisdom had made her a community leader, reported that plantation owners were discussing the Negro problem in terms that suggested they viewed enslaved people as temporary assets whose eventual replacement with immigrant labor would eliminate management complications. The conversations revealed long-term planning that assumed enslaved populations would be disposable once alternative labor sources became available. The most disturbing intelligence came from Alliah's husband Calvin, whose blacksmith shop served customers from across the territory. Plantation owners had begun commissioning restraint devices and punishment equipment that exceeded anything previously used in Nevada. The orders included devices designed to prevent escape attempts through permanent physical disability, suggesting that owners preferred crippled workers to the possibility of successful resistance. Food quality deteriorated as plantation owners substituted animal feed for human rations, arguing that enslaved people required no better nutrition than livestock. Corn intended for cattle replaced wheat flour, while meat disappeared entirely from most plantation diets. The nutritional deficiencies created widespread illness that owners attributed to laziness or natural inferiority rather than starvation. Working conditions in cotton fields became increasingly dangerous as owners eliminated safety procedures that might slow production. Machinery maintenance was deferred to save money, resulting in equipment failures that caused severe injuries. Medical treatment for workplace accidents was considered an unnecessary expense unless the injured person possessed skills that made replacement costs prohibitive. The territorial legislature passed new laws, requiring enslaved people to carry identification papers at all times and imposing severe penalties for anyone found without proper documentation. The legislation effectively eliminated any possibility of legal travel between plantations, making Alliah's seamstress work increasingly dangerous as authorities could arrest her for movement that had previously been routine. Plantation owners began sharing information about troublemakers suspected of resistance activities, creating blacklists that could result in sale to more brutal operations or summary execution. The coordination meant that anyone identified as a potential leader faced immediate removal from the territory, eliminating experienced organizers who might challenge the system. Sunday gatherings, which had provided enslaved communities with opportunities for social connection and cultural preservation, were restricted or eliminated entirely. Plantation owners argued that group activities facilitated resistance planning and decided that isolation would prove more effective than surveillance for preventing organized opposition. The cumulative effect of these changes created conditions that pushed the territory's enslaved population beyond the limits of endurance. People who had survived previous hardships through hope and community support found themselves facing systematic degradation designed to eliminate their humanity entirely. The pressure had reached levels where resistance was no longer a choice, but a necessity for survival. The breaking point came on a December morning when Alliah arrived at Broken Arrow Plantation to deliver winter clothing and discovered a scene that shattered her last hope for gradual change. In the plantation's experimental fields, she found 18 people collapsed from chemical exposure, their bodies convulsing from substances that Sandro Dreimer had introduced to test cotton treatment methods. The plantation doctor had been instructed to document symptoms rather than provide treatment, turning human suffering into research data. Among the victims was Tavira Morwin, a young mother whose 3-year-old son waited in the quarters unaware that his mother was dying from deliberate poisoning. Alliah knelt beside Tavira as she struggled to breathe, her skin burned by chemicals that had been applied without protective equipment or safety precautions. The woman's last words were a whispered plea for someone to care for her son, who would now face the plantation system as an orphan. The plantation overseer, Daryl Fenmark, explained the situation with casual indifference that revealed how completely the system had dehumanized everyone involved. The chemical treatments were part of a research project funded by Eastern agricultural colleges, designed to increase cotton yields through methods that happened to be toxic to human beings. The enslaved workers were test subjects whose health was considered irrelevant compared to the potential profits from improved crops. Fenmark showed Alliah the research protocols with pride, explaining how the systematic exposure of enslaved people to various chemical combinations would provide valuable data for agricultural science. The documents treated human beings as laboratory animals, with detailed charts tracking symptoms, mortality rates, and optimal exposure levels for maximizing both crop yields and worker survival times. The casual cruelty of using people as disposable test subjects represented a new level of dehumanization that went beyond even the most brutal aspects of traditional plantation slavery. Alliah realized that the territorial system had evolved into something approaching systematic extermination, where enslaved people were viewed not just as property, but as expendable research materials. Later that evening, Alliah attended an emergency meeting of plantation owners at the Nevada Cotton Exchange, where she was delivering repaired garments to Kieran Draveth. Hidden behind stacked cotton bales, she overheard conversations that revealed the true scope of what enslaved communities faced in the coming year. The plantation owners had formed a consortium to coordinate cost reduction strategies that would eliminate what they termed non-productive population segments. Their plans included systematic starvation of elderly people, disabled individuals, and anyone whose productivity had declined due to age or injury. The consortium had calculated that allowing these people to die would reduce operational costs by 30% while maintaining overall production levels. Sandro Dreimeer presented his chemical research findings with enthusiasm, noting that the experimental treatments had successfully increased cotton yields by 15%. He recommended expanding the program to include all plantations, despite mortality rates that approached 50% among exposed workers. The other owners agreed that short-term worker mortality was acceptable if it produced sustainable increases in crop profitability. The most chilling moment came when the consortium discussed their long-term vision for the territory's development. They planned to gradually replace enslaved labor with Chinese immigrants who could be paid subsistence wages while working under conditions similar to slavery. The transition would require eliminating existing enslaved populations through a combination of deadly working conditions, starvation, and strategic sales to plantations in more brutal regions. Kieran Dravath outlined a timeline for this transition that treated human beings as inventory to be liquidated before replacement. The consortium had calculated that working their current enslaved populations to death over 5 years while simultaneously importing alternative labor would maximize short-term profits while positioning Nevada for long-term economic growth. Governor Lorik Venret's representative at the meeting confirmed that territorial authorities would support these initiatives through legislative changes and reduced oversight of plantation operations. The government viewed the consortium's plan as an innovative approach to regional development that could serve as a model for other Western territories. As Alliah listened to these discussions, she understood that gradual resistance, or incremental change, could never address the systematic extermination being planned for her people. The plantation owners had moved beyond exploitation toward deliberate genocide, treating enslaved communities as obstacles to be eliminated rather than resources to be managed. The realization struck her with devastating clarity. Every person she had worked to protect faced death within months unless someone could implement immediate, massive intervention. The careful, patient approach she had followed for years was now insufficient for the scale of crisis her communities faced. Returning to her workshop that night, Alliah spread out the maps and communication networks she had developed over 8 years of preparation. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that her liberation plan might be the only hope for preventing systematic slaughter of hundreds of people. The intelligence her network had gathered suddenly took on new urgency. Every detail about guard schedules, transportation routes, and safe houses represented the difference between life and death for families who would otherwise face deliberate extermination. The patient preparation that had seemed like cautious planning now appeared to be providential preparation for an emergency that demanded immediate action. She calculated the logistics one more time, knowing that failure would result in retaliation that could destroy every person she cared about. The plan required coordinating simultaneous operations across 7 plantations, moving over 300 people through hostile territory, and establishing sustainable passage to free states where they could rebuild their lives. The risk was enormous, but the alternative was certain death for everyone she had spent years organizing and protecting. Alliah realized that her network had been preparing for this moment without knowing it, developing the capabilities and relationships that could make unprecedented liberation possible. As she began drafting coded messages for her key operatives, Alliah felt the weight of responsibility for decisions that would determine whether Nevada's enslaved communities survived or perished. The consortium's plans had made gradual change impossible, forcing her to choose between the safety of inaction and the desperate hope of coordinated resistance. The catalyst moment had arrived, demanding that 8 years of careful preparation be risked in a single night that would either achieve freedom for hundreds of people or result in their destruction through retaliation. There could be no middle ground between liberation and extermination, no compromise between survival and systematic slaughter. The time for patience had ended. The time for action had begun. Alliah sat in her workshop through the darkest hours before dawn, surrounded by maps that could sentence her to death, and lists of names representing hundreds of lives hanging in the balance. The coded messages she had drafted lay arranged across her work table like tarot cards, predicting an uncertain future. Each piece of paper represented a choice that could never be undone, a commitment that would either save her people or destroy them all. The weight of 8 years of preparation pressed down on her shoulders as she calculated the odds of success one final time. 300 people scattered across 7 plantations, 400 miles of hostile territory to traverse, and a network of allies whose loyalty would be tested beyond anything they had previously faced. The mathematics of liberation seemed impossible when laid out in stark detail. Her husband Calvin sat beside her, his weathered hands tracing the escape routes they had mapped through Nevada's unforgiving landscape. As a freed blacksmith, he possessed legal protections that could shield him from the worst consequences if their plan failed. But he also understood that his wife's choices would determine whether he spent the rest of his life as a widower mourning someone executed for treason against the territorial order. "The northern pass through the Sierra Nevada," Calvin said quietly, pointing to a route marked in pencil across their most detailed map. "Snow could close it any day now. If we're caught there with 300 people and no way forward or back, it becomes a mass grave instead of an escape route." Alliah nodded, having wrestled with the same concern through sleepless nights of planning. The seasonal timing that made coordinated liberation possible also created weather risks that could doom everyone involved. December offered the longest nights for concealed movement, but also brought winter storms that could trap large groups in exposed mountain terrain. "The alternative routes add 2 weeks to the journey," she replied, indicating paths that wound through lower elevations. 2 weeks of exposure, with tracking parties and territorial militias having time to organize pursuit operations, and 2 weeks of feeding 300 people from supplies we can't carry in sufficient quantities. The logistical challenges multiplied with every detail they examined. Moving 300 people required food, water, warm clothing, medical supplies, and transportation for those too young, old, or sick to walk 400 miles through winter conditions. The resources needed exceeded anything their network could accumulate without attracting attention that would expose the entire operation. Calvin opened the small wooden box where they kept their most dangerous documents, detailed intelligence about plantation security, guard rotations, and communication systems that connected Nevada's enslaved communities. The information represented years of careful observation by dozens of people who had risked everything to gather intelligence that might never be used. "May Linton's last report from Copper Creek," he said, unfolding a paper covered in tiny script that documented overseer schedules and security procedures. "She says Jonas Thalvin has been asking questions about unusual communications between plantations. If he suspects coordinated resistance, he might increase security just when we need it most relaxed." The possibility of discovery haunted every aspect of their planning. Plantation owners who had grown complacent about security in their isolated territory might suddenly implement new precautions that would make liberation impossible. A single suspicious overseer or betrayal by one frightened participant could unravel the entire network before the operation began. Alliah studied the faces sketched on papers scattered around her workshop, portraits of the key operatives whose courage would determine whether liberation succeeded or failed. Aaron Valmont at Broken Arrow Plantation had developed relationships with stable hands and transport workers who might provide horses and wagons for the most vulnerable escapees. His position gave him access to information about travel schedules and freight movements that could conceal large-scale population movement. Rowena Drayless' spiritual leadership among the territory's enslaved communities provided moral authority that could overcome individual fears and doubts about participating in such a dangerous enterprise. Her endorsement of the liberation plan carried weight that transcended plantation boundaries, but also made her a target for retaliation if their activities were discovered prematurely. May Linton's position in the Copper Creek kitchen gave her influence over food supplies and meal schedules that could create opportunities for coordinated action while providing cover for unusual movements within plantation boundaries. Her intelligence about overseer routines and security procedures had been crucial for timing their operations to avoid detection. Each person represented not just an individual commitment to resistance, but entire families whose lives would be forfeit if the liberation attempt failed. Plantation owners had made clear that any organized resistance would be met with systematic execution of everyone suspected of involvement, along with their relatives and associates. The moral weight of leadership pressed against Alliah's conscience as she considered alternatives to the massive coordinated operation she had planned. Smaller incremental escapes might save some people without risking mass retaliation, but would also leave the majority to face the systematic extermination that plantation owners had planned for the coming year. Gradual resistance through work slowdowns and equipment sabotage could disrupt plantation operations without triggering the violent response that mass escape would certainly provoke. But such tactics would do nothing to address the immediate threat posed by chemical experiments and deliberate starvation that were already killing people in her community. The option of seeking legal intervention through territorial courts or federal authorities offered another theoretical alternative, but Alliyah's experience with Nevada's political system provided no reason for optimism. The territorial government existed to serve plantation interests, while federal authorities had consistently supported slavery's expansion into western regions. Her personal history added another layer of complexity to the decision she faced. Unlike enslaved people who had known only bondage, Alliah remembered fragments of freedom from her earliest childhood, before being sold into the plantation system. The knowledge of what life could be like without constant fear and degradation made submission more psychologically difficult, but also provided perspective that informed her understanding of what liberation could mean. The relationship she had built over 8 years of resistance organizing represented both her greatest strength and most vulnerable weakness. The trust other people had placed in her leadership created obligations that extended beyond her own survival to encompass the welfare of entire communities who looked to her for guidance and hope. Calvin's presence beside her highlighted the personal costs that resistance would impose on everyone connected to the network. As her husband, he would face suspicion and harassment regardless of his legal status if authorities discovered her role in coordinated liberation. Their marriage had always been both a source of strength and a potential liability in the dangerous work of resistance organizing. The financial resources required for supporting 300 refugees during their journey to free territory represented another dimension of the decision Alliah faced. Calvin's blacksmith business provided some income, but nothing approaching the scale needed for such an ambitious operation. Success would require support from abolition networks in free states, connections that remained uncertain despite years of careful relationship building. The coded communication system she had developed for coordinating resistance activities across multiple plantations would need to function flawlessly under conditions of extreme stress and time pressure. Messages that took weeks to deliver during normal operations would need to be transmitted and understood within hours when the liberation began. Weather forecasts based on traditional knowledge and careful observation suggested that clear conditions might continue for another 2 weeks, providing the window of opportunity needed for coordinated escape. But winter storms in the Sierra Nevada could develop rapidly, trapping large groups in mountain passes where rescue would be impossible and survival unlikely. The psychological preparation required for participants in such a dangerous enterprise represented perhaps the most challenging aspect of Alliyah's planning. People who had survived by avoiding attention and minimizing risk would need to embrace radical action that violated every survival instinct they had developed through years of careful submission. As dawn approached, Alliah realized that her calculations and contingency planning had reached their limits. The decision before her could not be reduced to mathematical probability or logical analysis. Either she trusted in the network she had built and the preparations she had made, or she accepted that her people would face systematic extermination without organized resistance. The sound of Calvin's breathing beside her provided the only rhythm in the silence that surrounded her final choice. 8 years of patient preparation had brought her to a moment when patience became complicity in genocide. The careful balance between safety and resistance that had sustained her network through years of gradual organization now demanded transformation into something unprecedented and irreversible. She picked up her pen and began writing the final coded messages that would either liberate 300 people or lead them all to destruction. The words flowed onto paper with the certainty of someone who had exhausted every alternative and found them all inadequate for the crisis her community faced. The decision was made. The liberation would begin in 72 hours, when the new moon provided maximum darkness for coordinated movement across 7 plantations. Every person she had trained, every relationship she had built, every resource she had accumulated would be tested in a single night that would determine whether Nevada's enslaved communities survived or perished. There could be no hesitation, no second thoughts, no retreat from the commitment she was making to hundreds of people who had placed their lives in her hands. The network she had built would either prove capable of achieving impossible liberation or would die in the attempt to prevent systematic slaughter of everyone they had worked to protect. The messages were sealed and ready for delivery. The moment of decision had passed, replaced by the certainty of action that would reshape the Nevada Territory's history within a matter of hours. The new moon hung invisible in the December sky as Alliah made her final preparations in the pre-dawn darkness of December 15, 1852. Her workshop had been transformed into a command center where coded messages, detailed maps, and carefully crafted tools waited for the most ambitious liberation operation in American history. The silence felt different than usual, charged with the anticipation of irreversible change that would begin within hours. Calvin moved through their house with the methodical precision of someone completing tasks that might never be repeated. He packed essential supplies into saddlebags designed to look like routine blacksmith equipment, while securing their property against the retaliation that would certainly follow if their role in the liberation was discovered. Every action carried the weight of permanence, as if they were preparing for their own disappearance along with the 300 people they hoped to free. The first coded message had been delivered to May Linton at Copper Creek Plantation 3 days earlier, hidden within the seams of winter clothing that Alliah routinely transported between properties. The message contained detailed instructions for coordinating food preparation and distribution that would sustain 300 people during their journey to free territory, along with timing signals that would synchronize activities across all 7 target plantations. May's response, received through their established communication network, confirmed that kitchen staff at Copper Creek had gradually accumulated extra food supplies without attracting overseer attention. The surplus provisions were being disguised as normal seasonal stockpiling, while cooking equipment suitable for large group meal preparation was being repositioned near the plantation's outer buildings, where it could be quickly transported during the liberation. Aaron Valmont at Broken Arrow Plantation had received instructions for coordinating transportation logistics through messages hidden in horse equipment that Alliah regularly repaired as part of her seamstress services. His response indicated that stable hands sympathetic to resistance activities had identified horses and wagons that could be temporarily borrowed without immediate detection, while scouts had mapped travel routes that avoided main roads and populated areas. The transportation plan relied on Aaron's understanding of freight schedules and commercial traffic patterns that could provide cover for large-scale movement during the liberation's initial phases. Legitimate shipping activities would mask the sound and appearance of wagons carrying refugees, while creating confusion that could delay pursuit operations until the escaped populations had substantial head starts. Rowena Dryolet's role required the most delicate coordination, as her spiritual leadership needed to overcome individual fears and doubts without attracting attention from overseers who might suspect organized resistance. Her messages to community leaders across the 7 plantations emphasized the moral necessity of coordinated action, while providing emotional support for people facing the most dangerous decision of their lives. The elderly woman's influence had been crucial for recruiting participants who possessed essential skills but might otherwise have avoided such risky enterprise. Her endorsement convinced blacksmiths, carpenters, medical practitioners, and other specialists to join the liberation, despite their understanding that failure would result in execution for everyone involved. As midnight approached on December 15th, Alliah began the final phase of message distribution that would trigger simultaneous operations across hundreds of miles of territory. Each plantation's liberation would begin at precisely 2 a.m., providing maximum darkness for initial movement, while ensuring that all 7 operations commenced before any single plantation's activities could alert others. The coordination required split-second timing that tested communication systems developed over 8 years of resistance organizing. Signals would pass between plantations through networks of people who understood that mistimed coordination could doom everyone involved, while successful synchronization might achieve liberation that seemed impossible under normal circumstances. Westwind Plantation's liberation began exactly on schedule as Alliah moved through the quarters, distributing pre-positioned supplies while coordinating the evacuation of 63 people, ranging from infants to elderly individuals who required assisted transportation. The operation's success depended on moving quickly enough to avoid detection, while ensuring that no one was accidentally left behind. The most challenging aspect involved managing the psychological pressure on participants who had never attempted anything approaching organized resistance. People who had survived through careful compliance with plantation rules suddenly faced decisions that violated every survival instinct they had developed through years of systematic oppression. Young mothers clutched infants while trying to pack essential belongings into bundles small enough to carry during extended travel. Elderly people struggled with the physical demands of rapid movement while wrestling with fears about their ability to survive the journey to free territory. The human reality of liberation proved far more complex than the logistical planning had anticipated. May Linton's operations at Copper Creek Plantation encountered the first significant complication when overseer Jonas Thalvin made an unexpected inspection of the kitchen facilities just as food distribution was beginning. The timing threatened to expose the entire operation before it could gain momentum, forcing May to improvise explanations for unusual activity that could have resulted in immediate investigation. Her quick thinking transformed the suspicious food preparation into a surprise celebration for Thalvin's recent promotion, complete with specially prepared dishes that distracted him from the larger-scale provisioning occurring simultaneously. The deception bought enough time for evacuation to continue, but cost precious minutes that affected coordination with other plantations. Aaron Valmont's transportation coordination at Broken Arrow Plantation proceeded smoothly until weather conditions began deteriorating faster than meteorological predictions had suggested, when patterns that should have remained stable shifted unexpectedly, bringing cloud cover that provided additional concealment but also threatened the clear conditions necessary for navigation across unfamiliar terrain. The weather changes forced real-time adjustments to travel routes that had been planned months in advance, requiring scouts to identify alternative paths while maintaining the precise timing necessary for coordinated arrival at predetermined rendezvous points. The flexibility built into their planning proved essential as conditions evolved beyond anyone's control. Rowena Drealis' spiritual leadership became crucial as individual fears and doubts threatened to overwhelm some participants' determination to continue with the liberation. The psychological pressure of irreversible commitment to such dangerous enterprise created panic responses that could have exposed the entire operation if not managed with extraordinary care and wisdom. Her ability to provide emotional support while maintaining operational security helped overcome moments of crisis that might otherwise have resulted in discovery or abandonment of the liberation attempt. The combination of moral authority and practical guidance proved indispensable for managing human reactions that no amount of logistical planning could have anticipated. By 4 a.m., reports from all 7 plantations confirmed that initial evacuation phases had been completed successfully, with over 300 people beginning their coordinated journey toward free territory. The most dangerous phase of the operation had been executed without detection, but the greatest challenges lay ahead in the form of 400 miles of hostile terrain and pursuit operations that would certainly follow. The first 24 hours required covering as much distance as possible before plantation owners discovered the evacuations and organized tracking parties. The refugee columns needed to maintain rapid pace while caring for elderly, sick, and very young participants who could not sustain the physical demands of extended travel through winter conditions. Navigation proved more difficult than anticipated, as cloud cover obscured celestial reference points that guides had planned to use for maintaining correct direction. The groups were forced to rely on landmarks and terrain features that were less reliable, increasing the risk of becoming lost in territory where mistakes could prove fatal. Food and water management became critical issues as the reality of sustaining 300 people during extended travel exceeded theoretical calculations. Despite careful planning, the physical demands of rapid movement through difficult terrain created nutritional requirements that strained supply systems beyond their designed capacity. Medical emergencies among vulnerable participants created additional complications that threatened to slow progress below the minimum pace necessary for staying ahead of pursuit operations. Elderly people and those with chronic health conditions began experiencing problems that required care but could not be provided without risking the entire group's safety. The psychological pressure on group leaders intensified as they faced decisions about whether to maintain pace that might cost individual lives or slow progress that could doom everyone if tracking parties caught up with the refugee columns. The moral complexity of liberation proved far more challenging than the logistical obstacles they had anticipated. Communication between the 7 refugee groups required maintaining contact across vast distances while avoiding detection by territorial authorities who would certainly organize coordinated pursuit once the evacuations were discovered. The network that had enabled planning now needed to function under conditions of extreme mobility and constant danger. By noon on December 16th, smoke signals from Carson Valley indicated that plantation owners had discovered the evacuations and were organizing territorial militia units for pursuit operations. The liberation had achieved its initial objectives, but now faced the greater challenge of successfully transporting 300 refugees across hostile territory to safety in free states. Weather conditions continued deteriorating as afternoon brought the first snow of what would become a major winter storm. The precipitation provided additional concealment but also increased the difficulty of travel for people who lacked adequate winter clothing and equipment for extended exposure to harsh conditions. The refugee columns were forced to seek temporary shelter in terrain that offered protection from weather but increased vulnerability to discovery by tracking parties. The balance between physical survival and operational security created impossible choices that tested every aspect of the liberation's planning and execution. As evening approached, reports from advance scouts indicated that territorial militia units were organizing systematic search operations that would begin at dawn on December 17th. The pursuit would be coordinated across multiple counties with resources that far exceeded anything the refugee groups could deploy for counter-surveillance or defensive purposes. The first day of liberation had achieved unprecedented success in evacuating 300 people from 7 plantations without violence or detection until after the operations were completed. But the true test of whether mass liberation was possible would come in the following days, as pursuit operations intensified and weather conditions made travel increasingly dangerous. Alliah stood at the edge of their first overnight encampment, watching 300 people who had trusted her with their lives prepare for what might be their final night of freedom if the journey failed. The weight of responsibility for so many lives pressed against her consciousness as she calculated the odds of reaching safety against the mounting obstacles they faced. The liberation had begun exactly as planned, but success would ultimately depend on whether their network's capabilities could overcome challenges that exceeded anything they had previously attempted. The next phase would determine whether December 15, 1852, marked the beginning of freedom or the start of tragedy for everyone who had chosen resistance over submission. The territorial militia's pursuit operations began at dawn on December 17th, but what they discovered defied every expectation about coordinated slave resistance. Instead of panicked flight leaving obvious trails through winter landscape, the tracking parties found evidence of systematic preparation that suggested military-level organization and intelligence gathering. The refugee columns had vanished into Nevada's vast terrain as completely as if the earth itself had swallowed them. Sheriff Calvin Drake led the largest pursuit force, following what appeared to be the main evacuation route toward the Sierra Nevada passes. His experienced trackers found deliberate false trails that led to dead ends, supply caches that had been emptied and abandoned according to predetermined schedules, and communication markers that indicated coordination between groups separated by dozens of miles. The sophistication of the liberation operation forced Drake to reconsider everything he thought he understood about enslaved populations in the Nevada Territory. These were not desperate people fleeing without plan or direction, but organized communities executing strategies that had been developed over years of careful preparation. The implications for territorial security and social control were staggering. By December 20th, pursuit operations had covered over 200 miles of terrain without recovering a single refugee or identifying the routes being used for their escape. Weather conditions that had initially hampered the fugitives now worked in their favor, as heavy snow obliterated tracks, while creating visibility problems that made systematic searching impossible. The territorial government's response revealed the political crisis that mass liberation had created for Nevada's leadership. Governor Alliah Vorric convened emergency sessions with plantation owners and federal representatives to address what newspapers were calling the largest escape in American history. The scale of coordinated resistance challenged fundamental assumptions about slavery's viability in Western territories. Plantation owners demanded federal military intervention to recover their property and prevent similar incidents from inspiring resistance movements across the region. The financial losses exceeded $2 million in property value, while the psychological impact threatened to destabilize the entire territorial economy based on enslaved labor. Federal authorities faced their own dilemma in responding to Nevada's crisis. Military resources were limited across Western territories, while political considerations made large-scale operations problematic. The Compromise of 1850 had established delicate balances regarding slavery in new territories that massive federal intervention might disrupt. The investigation into how such extensive organization had developed undetected revealed disturbing intelligence gaps in plantation security systems. Interviews with remaining enslaved people produced no useful information, as communities that had perfected the art of protective silence maintained their discipline even under intense interrogation. Calvin Drake's blacksmith shop was searched extensively after his wife's disappearance coincided suspiciously with the liberation timing, but investigators found only routine business records and equipment. The couple had prepared for official scrutiny by removing any evidence of resistance activities while maintaining plausible explanations for their movements and communications. The search revealed hidden compartments and communication systems that demonstrated sophisticated planning, but no direct evidence linking specific individuals to the coordination of liberation activities. Even under pressure that included threats of prosecution, no one provided information that could identify the network's leadership or operational methods. By January 1853, territorial authorities were forced to acknowledge that recovery operations had failed completely. Not a single refugee had been recaptured, despite pursuit efforts that involved hundreds of searchers and resources that strained the territorial government's capabilities. The escaped populations had successfully disappeared into free territory or hidden locations beyond Nevada's jurisdiction. The economic impact on plantation operations proved devastating and permanent. Insurance companies refused to cover losses from coordinated escape attempts, while banks became reluctant to finance agricultural ventures that could disappear overnight. The foundation of Nevada's plantation economy had been shaken beyond repair. More significantly, news of the successful mass liberation spread rapidly through enslaved communities across the American West. Within months, plantation owners in California, Oregon, and Utah territories reported increased resistance activities and attempted escapes that seemed inspired by Nevada's example. The psychological transformation among remaining enslaved populations was immediately apparent to plantation owners who had previously managed their human property through assumptions about hopelessness and isolation. People who had accepted bondage as permanent now understood that coordinated resistance could achieve unprecedented liberation. Plantation security measures increased dramatically across Western territories as owners attempted to prevent similar operations. But the enhanced surveillance and restrictions actually accelerated resistance activities by making oppressive conditions more obvious to enslaved communities that had learned from Nevada's success. The territorial government's official response involved denying the scale and significance of what had occurred while implementing legislative changes designed to prevent future coordinated resistance. New laws required enslaved people to carry identification at all times, restricted movement between plantations, and imposed severe penalties for any gathering of more than 3 people. But enforcement proved problematic as the legislation's requirements exceeded administrative capabilities while creating new opportunities for resistance through non-compliance. The attempt to tighten control actually demonstrated the system's weakness and encouraged further challenges to plantation authority. Federal investigations concluded that the Nevada liberation had been planned and executed by outside agitators rather than local enslaved communities, despite evidence suggesting extensive internal organization and coordination. The official findings protected political relationships while avoiding acknowledgement of systematic resistance capabilities. The truth about Alliah Vance and her network's fate remained mysterious for decades after the liberation. Some evidence suggested that she had successfully reached free territory with the main refugee group, while other reports indicated that she had remained in Nevada to continue resistance activities under different identity. Sightings of a woman matching Alliah's description were reported across California and Oregon during the 1850s, often in connection with underground railroad activities that helped escaped enslaved people reach permanent safety in Canada. But none of these reports could be verified, and her ultimate fate became part of the legend that grew around Nevada's liberation. The carved symbols found at plantation sites after the mass escape became focal points for continuing resistance activities across Western territories. Similar markings appeared at sites of subsequent liberation attempts, suggesting that Nevada's network had either survived or inspired imitators who adopted their methods. May Linton, Aaron Valmont, and Rowena Drelith were never positively identified as participants in the liberation, despite intensive investigations by territorial authorities. Like other suspected network members, they seem to have vanished completely, while leaving no evidence of their involvement in coordinated resistance activities. The mystery surrounding their disappearance contributed to growing legends about supernatural assistance in the liberation operation. Enslaved communities began telling stories about spirit guides who helped their people escape bondage, while plantation owners reported unexplained phenomena at sites where escapes had occurred. By 1855, the Nevada Territory's plantation system had collapsed entirely due to economic pressures and continuing resistance that made enslaved labor unreliable. The successful mass liberation had demonstrated that coordinated organization could overcome geographical and political barriers that had seemed insurmountable. The territorial economy shifted toward free wage labor and different agricultural methods that did not depend on enslaved populations. While this transition created new opportunities for some residents, it also eliminated the wealth concentration that had made territorial elites politically powerful. Governor Alliah Vorric's political career ended in disgrace as federal authorities blamed his administration for security failures that had enabled the largest slave escape in American history. His successors focused on economic development strategies that avoided dependence on enslaved labor. The Nevada Liberation's influence extended far beyond immediate territorial boundaries as news of the successful operation spread through abolition networks across the United States. Frederick Douglass wrote extensively about the strategic implications of coordinated resistance, while Harriet Tubman incorporated lessons from Nevada into her own Underground Railroad activities. Southern plantation owners lobbied for federal legislation that would prevent similar operations by strengthening fugitive slave laws and increasing penalties for assisting escape attempts. But the political momentum generated by Nevada's success contributed to growing opposition to slavery's expansion into Western territories. The Civil War that began in 1861 traced some of its origins to tensions created by resistance movements that Nevada's liberation had inspired across Western regions. The demonstration that enslaved people could organize sophisticated operations challenged pro-slavery arguments about racial inferiority and natural subordination. Modern historians studying the Nevada liberation have identified it as a crucial precedent for later resistance movements that used coordinated organization and strategic planning to overcome oppressive systems. The network's methods influenced civil rights organizing techniques that proved effective nearly a century later. Archaeological investigations of former plantation sites have discovered additional evidence of the sophisticated communication and coordination systems that made mass liberation possible. Hidden message centers, supply caches, and transportation infrastructure reveal planning that extended over years of careful preparation. The site of the former Westwind plantation is now marked by a memorial commemorating the courage of people who chose freedom over security, resistance over submission. The inscription reads simply, "On this site, 300 souls chose dignity over survival and proved that no system of oppression can withstand coordinated human determination." But visitors to Nevada's former plantation regions report experiences that suggest the liberation's legacy extends beyond historical commemoration. On winter nights when snow covers the desert landscape, travelers describe hearing sounds that might be voices singing freedom songs, or seeing lights that could be signal fires guiding escaped people toward safety. Local residents speak of finding carved symbols that match those discovered after the 1852 liberation, appearing in locations where no modern person could have placed them. Whether these phenomena represent supernatural activity or human commemoration, they maintain connection to a moment when impossible liberation became historical reality. The carved symbols themselves have become powerful emblems for modern civil rights and social justice movements that trace their inspiration to people who proved that systematic oppression could be overcome through courage, organization, and unwavering commitment to human dignity. Today, the interlocking circles with radiating lines appear on everything from protest banners to community organization logos, carrying forward the message that coordinated resistance can achieve what individual action cannot accomplish. The Nevada liberation symbols have transcended their historical context to represent universal principles of resistance and liberation. School curricula across the western United States now include instruction about the Nevada liberation as an example of strategic thinking and coordinated action that achieved seemingly impossible objectives through careful planning and community cooperation. Students learn about organizational methods that proved effective against systematic oppression. The mystery of what happened to Alliah Vorric and her network adds continuing fascination to a story that already represents one of the most remarkable achievements in American resistance history. Whether they found permanent freedom or continued fighting for others, Liberation, their legacy lives on in every movement that chooses organized resistance over passive acceptance of injustice. The empty plantation quarters discovered on December 16, 1852, marked more than the successful escape of 300 enslaved people. They represented proof that human dignity could overcome any system designed to destroy it, that coordinated organization could achieve liberation that seemed impossible, and that the power to choose freedom ultimately rested with people who had been told they possessed no power at all. The Nevada liberation stands as testament to the truth that no oppression, however systematic or geographically isolated, can permanently contain human beings who refuse to accept degradation as their permanent condition. 300 people proved that freedom is not granted by authorities, but claimed by those with courage to risk everything for the chance to live as fully human beings. In the end, the morning mist that revealed empty quarters on August 12, 1852 had lifted to expose something far more significant than successful escape. It revealed the power of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary liberation when they choose coordination over isolation, planning over desperation, and collective action over individual submission. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.